Hello. Welcome everyone to another excellent webinar from here at Prevalent. We're so happy to see people trickling in here. While we are getting ready and waiting for people to join, I'm going to throw up a poll here, and we'd love to know what prompted you to join this webinar today. Is it educational? Is it project research? You have something upcoming for third-party risk management you guys are looking to achieve. You don't know why you're here, which I truly don't know how you got here. If you don't know why you're here, I'd love to find that out. And you're also a Prevalent customer, which if you are, welcome back. It's great for you to keep joining these and stay informed. So I'll leave that up here while I do some quick introductions. So as everyone knows why you are here, it's right in front of you. We're discussing Breaking Bad, not the show. Don't get confused now. I almost was gonna get a hazmat suit just for this. So I was like, I don't know if it's worth it, but I was thinking about it. It was good. It would be pretty funny, but I didn't do it. Anyways, we want to know your thoughts on this, so we'd love to get your feedback. But Breaking Bad, again, not the show. No feedback on the show. This webinar, when your third-party risk program goes off the rails. I can't wait to learn about this and see if you guys do any puns based on the show. No pressure. But we have a great little panel with us today. We have our very own compliance experts, Project Director Joe Tolley and Contact Manager Thomas Humphreys, and they're going to be covering all the hot topics based on this and what to do when it's Breaking Bad. I gotta stop saying Breaking Bad. Anyways, so this is being recorded. Unfortunately for you, you have to rewatch this introduction again if you watch it. My dog's in the background. I apologize. But we also want to keep this interactive, so please put your questions in the Q&A. Chat gets pretty congested, but yes, please put the questions in the Q&A, and we're going to get to those at the end, and we'll make sure that we have time for that. I'm going to send you the recording directly, and you'll hear from myself or my counterpart, Melissa. So whenever you answer questions in the polls, please be honest, because I'm going to reach out regarding those questions, so there's no surprises there. You're all muted, obviously. That's about it from me. So I think we're good to go here, guys. Take it away.
Thank you very much, and a pleasure to join everyone today. So yeah, you got myself today, Joe Tolley and Thomas Humphreys. A bit about myself before we get started. I've been with Prevalent for a number of years now, focused mainly on the service delivery aspect, so preparing some of our deliverables to help clients get their programs created and built out. And then recently switched over to more of the program director or project role with a focus on trying to mature clients. So looking at the different stages that clients might be at in building out their program, intervening and being able to offer some guidance and tips and working collaboratively with them to get to where they need to be.
And my name is Thomas Humphreys. Hello, everyone. I'm the content manager at Prevalent. So as part of my role, I help to build and develop surveys, assessments based on a varying degree of regulatory matters and standards. Come up to 4 years now at Prevalent. Prior to this, I used to be an ISO auditor, working my way through various ISO standards in certification bodies in Singapore and the UK. And yes, as Amanda has alluded to at the beginning, we're talking about when your third-party risk program goes off the rails. I believe my colleague Joe is managing the slides, so we'll go straight to the agenda. So what's the purpose of today? So we discuss at a high level what are TPRM audit violations, what is the concept of audit violation, and how do we bring this into the TPRM space. From there, we'll then do a deeper dive into audit violation response, and obviously working our way through the life cycle of TPRM before stepping back and saying, well, we've discussed what a violation is, the immediate response we receive from auditors relating to our TPRM and our immediate next steps. then taking a look at how do you prevent audit violations in the long term as well. Before running through what we typically see and what we'd call commonly identified violations, again, across the broad spectrum of the TPRM process. And then, of course, time permitting at the end, we'll have a Q&A session. So just keep those questions flowing in throughout today's webinar.
Yeah, and as Amanda said, it'd be great to keep this nice and interactive. So any questions or words of wisdom posted in the chat would be great to see and to read those. But if there's no other items, let's get cracking. So to get started, Thomas, we should cover off probably what is a TPRM audit violation?
Absolutely. So TPRM, third-party risk management, and speaking of the wider third-party program and supplier some management program. So what are TPM audit violations? So audit violations can occur when internal or external assessments identify gaps in practices. So there are a lot of different types of audits, as you know, ranging from the ISO-based assessments and other security, privacy-based frameworks, even financial-based frameworks, and a lot of different assessments that can focus on and look at your third-party program. And of course, throughout this process, there's always going to be the opportunity for an assessor, again, whether it's internal or external, to identify gaps in the process, deviations based on what you're currently doing and what your processes and policies and practices say. And there also we call these violations. There are other terms for them, non-conformities, risks, to name but a few. And the key thing here to state is obviously that these violations can obviously hamper an organization's ability to manage its third-party risk. And obviously this can take a couple of strands. On the one side, it's looking at your own internal program of how you manage your third parties and design and apply assessments, for example, with which to measure and review third parties. It can also include failures within that process that could have a knock-on effect to when you're receiving third-party risks and the failure to address them appropriately and put some relevant remediation in place. And of course, it's always important to identify that violations can relate across all different areas of the TPRM process, and it could be both individual or combined failure in the process. What do I mean by this? From a singular perspective, if you take the example of failure to conduct proper third-party profiling and tiering, for example, as part of your onboarding process, or looking at multiple violations or gaps and issues that could all relate to the risk governance process. So failure to classify risk, failure to remediate risk, and the failure to assign sort of ownership and timestamps of when risks need to be treated. And they could all lead up into a wider, more comprehensive violation of the risk governance stage of the process.
Yeah, and apologies for the sirens there. That wasn't a Breaking Bad pun or anything there, just some outside noise. So Tom, when we're looking at these violations, what are auditors looking at? How are they assessing organizations?
Good question. So yes, there's a lot of areas that need to be, I guess, considered here, but ultimately, just as given the wide variety of audits and type of assessments that can be conducted, but obviously ultimately assessors are looking at the processes, the practices that the organization have defined. This is how we identify our third parties. This is how we manage them through to the point of receiving and dealing with risks. And it's through that process that I'll try and identify, is there a weakness? Is there a deficiency that we've said we've done something, but it's actually not being followed through? Or we've identified a process, but it's actually not mature enough. It's actually not giving us the aims, and it's not achieving the aims of what it was set out to do. And this then leads on to how a violation is raised. And as I say, there's obviously various different terminologies for this. If anyone's of the ISO nature, non-conformities is a common term used, major non-conformities, minor non-conformities, depending on obviously the severity of that violation.
Good stuff. So once I've conducted the audit of the program, They've presented to us as the client a list of non-conformities or weaknesses or violations. What is it essential we need to start doing when we get that information presented back to us?
So yes, another great question. There's a lot of factors to consider when you first receive that violation or weakness that's been identified by the assessor. Of course, in the ideal world, there'll be a lot of sort of depth to how the weakness is presented, how it's communicated, not least obviously why the weakness has been raised. Has it been purely a process failure, for example? There is no process or approach taken to remediate risks, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And also the context is quite key here as well. It's all very well being made aware of weaknesses, but of course, the more context you have, the more background that's being able to be shared through the assessment by the assessor is also going to make it easier for the organization when they start the process of associating and identifying impacts, likelihoods, and taking the process of prioritizing and implementing actions. And of course, the severity. The earlier we're aware of the severity or the perception of the severity of the violation of the weakness is again going to be a huge help moving forward. So these are some of the key areas that we typically look for or should be looked for to ascertain what the weakness is about.
Yeah, and if we have a weakness, is it something, and they've associated severity to it, is it common for auditors to base this on their own perception of severity? Or do they sometimes factor in, the personal impact that this particular weakness or violation might have on the organization?
I'd say it comes down to a bit of both. So there'll always be a structured, or typically there'll be a structured approach to classifying a weakness or a violation. Again, if I take the concept used by ISO certification bodies and ISO auditors, there's typically a clearly defined route of what is considered a major or minor non-conformity, and what does major and minor look like? What does that represent in terms of business impact? Is it something that's show-stopping, or is it something that's going to cause a chain reaction, or is it something that is very much an isolated case? At the same time, obviously with auditors, in particular when you get more experienced auditors, there'll always be a look at the assessment itself and how third-party risk management fits into the wider business as well. So you should always be looking at two angles. One, that structured approach of what does that severity actually mean in practical terms, but then also taking into account the context of the business and how it uses third-party and third-party risk management as well.
Yeah, good stuff. And these weaknesses, are they always something that have an impact on the organization from a risk standpoint, or are we going to see weaknesses associated to where we can maybe improve efficiencies within the program?
Oh, very, very much so. And it's apologize if you hear this a few times, but given I was an ISO auditor, it's something that's obviously stuck with me. But continual improvement is always key here. And yes, it's important when you're looking at any form of violation, weakness, to obviously look at the severity of it and how impacting it is as a business. It should always be seen also as an improvement opportunity. Whenever you design these processes, looking to continually improve them, mature them, and so there'll always be opportunity to say, well, if we do this, if we correct this, not only do we hopefully remove that weakness, remove that risk, but hopefully we can build a more succinct, more structured process or approach. Yeah,
so there's not always a reason to panic when we get an audit violation identified. It could be that these things are nice to have and further along down the line once we've matured the program a little bit more.
Absolutely, and that's if you have that mindset going in to assessments and when findings are received, just like how risks are received, it's only going to be a more positive experience, and you can get more out of obviously understanding where that weakness has occurred and why it's occurred.
Perfect. So if we get our report back and we don't fully understand the weakness that's been identified, or we need more context around the weakness and what meaning it has to our organization, is there a part in this process where we can engage back with the auditor to get what we need from that finding? Absolutely.
Now, I mentioned at the beginning that the ideal scenario will be an auditor report that contains the full details, so not only what the weakness is, why it's raised, the context behind it, some level of severity, and even down to the level of a proposed action or recommendation to say, well, this is what you should look at, or depending on the audit, this is what you should be doing to resolve it or to remove the risk. But if there is occasion, of course, where that level of detail isn't provided, there should always be some level of communication, some communication lines open, whether it's to engage with the auditors, the assessment bodies, once the report is provided, and when they're maybe on site, for example, but also post audit delivery as well, to check back with them to say, can you please explain some of the context behind this weakness or the reasoning or thinking behind this as well. Because I say that will all help to provide a better picture and ultimately better decision making internally.
Yeah, perfect. So yeah, we need to make sure we capture as much detail as possible from that identification process so that we can translate that into something that we can action and action correctly within the business. So that's the external piece done. We've got the data back. We've collected all the context and detail we need. Now, I guess we're moving on to that association of impact and likelihood, where we're looking to try and identify how severe or significant this finding is to the business, whether it is a potential risk that's being exposed here or just a more nice to have aspect of the program that's missing.
Absolutely, and I guess we're looking at a lot of different types of impact, aren't we, Joe, in terms of not only actually how you identify the impact, but how we start to formulate some form of sort of score or sort of calculation that we can obviously present back to the business as well. I mean, certainly areas that call to mind for myself quite quickly are going to be where the weakness has a wider impact on different business units. If for example, we're presented with a weakness around poor or lack of defined risk remediation process. As you know, risk features across a lot of different entities in an organization, across operations, particularly with dealing with third parties as well. And so it could be something that could impact a wider part of the organization.
So we can use probably a model then that's similar to managing a third party or a vendor risk, you know, looking at the different impact areas that could be affected if this risk was to materialize, looking along those different columns, like whether it's a regulatory impact, a financial impact, operational, etc., and drawing out some thresholds within those areas to be able to, you know, pick together exactly where this risk would sit so that we can manage it accordingly.
Absolutely, yes. And being able to identify, and particularly if you can get into a state of using best practices. I mean, there are a lot of obviously best practices out there using this concept of impacts and obviously likelihoods as well to define from a risk perspective, obviously frameworks such as ISO 31000 come to mind, obviously 27000 from a security perspective. But there's a lot of best practice out there that can help organizations to identify how do we know and what impacts are most appropriate to us. One of the other common examples, of course, we see is of course legal and regulatory. So where there's impacts from a weakness that are resulting from or that have an impact to a contractual agreement. If there's a clause in a third-party agreement, for example, and there's a weakness as a result of a third party failing to do something that potentially breaches that contract. And of course, that could be a significant impact to the business. So there's a lot of different areas to think about, but hopefully it's about getting to a stage where on the page, if you like, we've got a good set of impacts or impact rating based on each and every weakness identified.
Yeah. And I guess the same can be said for likelihood, same logic.
Yep, absolutely. So again, obviously we're getting to a different stage now. So if we imagine we have a weakness, if we take the example of risk remediation. So if we say an assessor has come through and they've given a critical or high risk, saying there's no defined risk remediation process in place. We've got to the stage where we've identified potential impacts on not doing proper remediation. Obviously, there's likelihood that risks could materialize further, or inappropriate or wrong actions are taken, and this builds up this impact score, as it will. From a likelihood perspective, of course, it's then saying, is there reasonable, what's the chance that this risk will occur, this weakness will increase or spread if we don't do anything about it? So have we identified that weakness that, again, linked back to the impact, would cause us to take maybe reprioritize or take quicker action?
Yeah. So with those two in combination, we can start to build pretty much an itemized risk register of potential audit violations. And I guess the crucial thing here is that if we get more than one violation back, or more than one violation identified through this audit process, it's essential that we need to start managing these together in one list so that we can appropriately align resources to fix them, and obviously we are targeting the ones that are more critical to us first.
Absolutely. And getting to that stage where we've got a clear understanding and agreement. Don't forget, this is important as well. When going through this process, impact and likelihood, getting agreement from those involved is important to make sure that there's a common understanding of how we classify and calculate these risks and weaknesses. But the ultimate aim here is to then enable that level of prioritization. So if we use perhaps obviously a well-known method is the critical, medium, high, low, or red, amber, green. Sometimes a traffic light system can help us to say, well, we may have multiple weaknesses that have been raised by the assessors, by the assessing body. But based on this process, based on understanding that level of impact and likelihood, we know that this set are more urgent. We need to take more action on these in the short term. Others, we may need to take action, but in the longer term, or we may have a longer time frame to do that. Or in some cases, no immediate action, but certainly a level of monitoring as well. Yeah,
I take it that looking at this whole process, the only way you're going to get accurate results that carry through to the remediation phase with the right impact, likelihood, and prioritization is by making sure we capture as much information as possible in that initial step.
Absolutely, and I guess this is where it comes back to that context. The more detail that we have of a weakness, where it's come from, and how severe it is, will only help to enhance this whole end-to-end process, and particularly when it comes to not only prioritizing, but working out how much effort, what do we actually need to do from an implementation standpoint. So you can imagine in that example of no risk remediation process, if it was truly the case that there is no, maybe you have the process where we can identify risks, we can classify them if third parties are, as a result of assessments, are bringing in a series of risks. But if we've got no approach to remediate, then these risks are clearly just going to either sit there ad infinitum potentially, or equally, if not worse, the wrong type of actions could be taken. And so obviously having that greater context and saying, do we need to take a more systematic approach to building a risk remediation process from scratch? Or is it a case of there is a process, but it's part of that risk remediation process that is actually failing or is not being followed correctly? And so that's why that importance of that context and having that discussion with the auditors from the outset is so critical.
Yeah, and with this approach, if there is additional resource needed to fix an issue, if there's additional, budget needing spending to fix an issue, I guess one thing that's always going to help internally is demonstrating the workings out of how the weakness was identified, how we translated that into something meaningful from a prioritization standpoint, and of course what actions we need to take to actually resolve the issue as well. So ensuring we have all of our workings out in order, a nice clear plan to take back to the business to say, here's the problem, here's the impact, and here's how we need to fix it. I guess that's going to pave the way for success in managing it from that point forwards.
Absolutely, and this then starts the process of standardization as well, and making sure we've got a standard and structured approach, particularly when it comes to those either future assessments to say, well, this is not only how we've addressed those issues, but we've now got a clear process of documenting what we've done, the decisions we've made, why we've made them, and there becomes a more logical, say, systematic flow for dealing with audit violations.
Yeah, makes complete sense. Thanks, Tom. So we've touched on there what happens when we get an audit violation, how we translate that into internal speak and produce a list of actionable items that we can manage, provided we get that business sort of buy-in. The next question, of course, is going to be, how do we prevent ourselves from getting those audit violations in the first place? And I guess to a degree, some of these might be unavoidable, especially if we're just starting out with a program. We don't have unlimited budget to cover all gaps within the program and make sure our program's completely optimized. But I believe there are some things that we can do to at least prepare for an audit violation. If, for example, a finding comes up and we're already aware of it, and the auditor discusses it with us, we can, of course, explain to them some of the processes we already have in place to address it in the future as well. I think one of the key things here that we often find isn't in place within a lot of programs is setting up these regular checkpoint sessions. I think sometimes organizations will set out on a goal to solve third-party risk or manage suppliers, and there's never a step back on a periodic basis to see whether it's working, where some deficiencies are, where further efficiencies can be gained. So making sure that a plan is put in place or a process is put in place to look at these the program on a regular basis is something that's going to be really useful. So scheduling, sorry, go ahead, Tom.
No, I'd say absolutely, and completely agree. And but I guess one thing that always comes to mind is the level of involvement, or who should be involved. So thinking about when you have those regular checkpoints, when you're trying to sit back and take a step back and reviewing what we're doing, are there improvement opportunities, or based on other factors? Is there any I guess obvious sort of thoughts or choices around who would typically be involved in such reviews?
Yeah, sure. I think we often recommend that a program always has someone that's the decision maker, that's there to provide guidance to the team below. A steering committee is really the audience I would target with something like this. Someone that has full visibility of not just the exec level contribution where information from the program might be going, but someone that also has visibility of what's going on the ground, how operational processes are running, how risks are being managed, what the workflow looks like. The more insight we can get into the detail of how the program's being managed, the more likely we're going to get an accurate picture of maturity and any weaknesses we're aware of within the program as well. I think looking at the model we have in front of us on the right hand side, one recommended approach we have is dividing a program up into the various pillars that make up a successful program, and actually coming up or utilizing something that's available to really use a standardized approach to measuring how well our program is functioning, and where those gaps are. It might be common that an organization looks and says, yes, we've got a great remediation process, but one thing that needs to happen periodically is a review of that same process in the same way, if not more enhanced, to make sure we're getting a better picture and an accurate level of maturity against that particular element. Objectives within the program might have changed, and now we have risk items that are associated to a different area that weren't being managed before, and we need additional training, and additional resource to manage an influx of risk that we might be getting. So making sure that we're using the same mechanisms to assess and manage the program is something that's going to be really helpful in driving the program forward, and making sure we're aware of any of those audit violations that might creep up without us being aware of them.
Absolutely. And I guess particularly thinking from a maturity standpoint, in many cases, it can always sort of be seen as a bit of a utopia, but there should always be an aim to, as the information there suggests, go from a stage where it's developed and it's scalable. We're starting to think of that concept of optimization, of being more visionary. Not least when you're looking at new and emerging threats and changes as well. It's always, I guess, easy to think about new and emerging threats. I guess the obvious ones coming to mind recently are ransomware. Anything that could impact from a TPRM perspective, the type of content, the type of assessments we're sending out to our third parties. But also business changes as well, and operational changes that could impact the way third parties are assessed, reviewed, monitored, and engaged. So having that top level view of saying, can we get to a stage where we're continually reviewing this and we're provided with that information that allows us to say, we can almost predict and we can adjust our program as necessary.
Yeah, so this type of function would provide constant reassurance that the right processes are in place, regardless of whether the scope of the program has changed, whether it's changed hands from an internal ownership perspective, and based on new resource that might have been hired as well. We're always measuring the program in the same way, identifying issues, and similar to the workflow that you just walked us through, Tom, making sure that if we do identify issues, we're managing them in exactly the same way, prioritizing them, aligning them to someone to be accountable for resolving them, and then based on the level of effort, internal capacity, resolving them where we can as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's again, I promise I won't use the word too much, but it's this continual improvement thing for me, which is so critical. This process of being able to have that regular checkpoint and say, do you know what, we've been working on this process for a while now. It's actually working effectively. We've had violations and weaknesses that have been reported, and we've got to a stage, hopefully, where we've addressed those. Can we get to a stage now where we can more easily almost identify where those weaknesses are prior to the auditor raising them themselves, and again continued improving that whole process through that monitoring, remediation of issues, being able to prioritize and obviously manage issues appropriately.
Perfect. So now that we covered off the preventing of the audit violation, we thought it might be good to touch on some of the common violations that we see across programs. So these may not be specifically called out from an audit standpoint, but things that we've identified as being common across different clients that we've worked with, different programs at varying different stages in maturity as well. So what we have in front of us are some of the key pillars that make up a program, such as scope. Is the scope of assessment and our third parties being onboarded in the right way into a program. Accuracy, is the content we're sending out fit for purpose? Does it meet all of the regulatory requirements that it needs to? Are we actually managing the responses from our vendors well? Is there timelines for getting data back and engaging with the business if we're not seeing the results we need to from a vendor? Looking at risk management, is that remediation workflow in place? Is it working? Is it efficient? And then lastly, looking at reporting and how we actually communicate back to the business the results of the program, and of course using that to demonstrate that it's actually functioning correctly. And then lastly, above that, we have governance, which just sits above, and there's some real common issues we see within that governance pillar of items not being reviewed enough. So what we wanted to do is spend a bit of time reviewing each of these pillars, looking at some of the commonly identified violations, then just covering off why it's important to start to consider these things. Because if these aren't being considered by yourselves within your own programs, then these could be pulled up by an auditor. So it's better to be aware of them now and be proactive rather than reactive. Tom, would you like to run through some of the scope and profiling information for us?
Absolutely. So yes, top of the pile is obviously vendor scope and profiling. I guess an overarching question of, is the scope of assessment and third-party context clear? So when thinking about the common violations that could be viewed and reported from an assessment itself, I guess number one, failure to identify the context of the service provided and how it will be delivered. So if you're thinking about this, the early stage of planning a third-party program and starting to reach out to third parties, if you're not aware of the full scope of service provision or the detail of how it's going to be delivered, where it's going to be delivered from, for example, this could be an immediate sign that perhaps we don't fully understand or are leading into our contracts with our third parties some key service provision. Inefficient information attributes captured to assist in profiling as well. This is an interesting point because, of course, when you think about, not only what it is the third parties are doing or providing to you, the products and services, but are there any key business attributes, informational attributes that can help in working out how do we profile this third party? Do we list them as a tier 1, a tier 2, or a tier 3, a critical, medium, or low? So attributes such as geographies. Is it an organization that's working outside the European Union, for example? And yet one of the key aspects that you may be discussing or using them for is for handling of personal data, and thinking about obviously GDPR and some of the regulation that sits around that can help to shape, do we need to increase them, or would you categorize them as a tier 1 given the criticality of understanding privacy requirements? None of identification of impact to the organization. Should they fail in the performance of delivery of services? Again, another interesting area that we have seen to crop up in terms of third-party violation. So thinking internally from the organizational aspect, if there are agreements with third parties, agreements have highlighted particular processes that need to be put in place, and those processes are not addressed or not delivered in a satisfactory way. The fact that we haven't identified any sort of impact to the organization may mean that it actually increases in its severity as we go on, because again, there's a lack of understanding of, if they haven't performed to this degree or delivered the service in the way that we expect, how do we approach that? How do we, how much of an impact is that having to the wider business? And then lastly, no mapping of fourth parties that may be critical to delivery of service. Fourth party is an interesting one. There does seem to be an increase in the visibility of sort of fourth party. If you look at some of the top level frameworks, such as NIST, from a security perspective, and SIG, for those of you from the US, the concept of fourth party and the wider supply chain is gaining more interest. And of course, if you're failing to map and identify the vendor's third parties or your fourth parties, again, this could impact not only the delivery of service, but obviously how any issues down the line and how that could impact back to yourself. So thinking about that provenance and of goods and services delivered.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. And it can be actually really simple to address some of these items as well. When we are onboarding a vendor, maybe we spend that little bit of extra time engaged with the supplier relationship manager, whatever that role might be, to actually collect some of these attributes from them, so that internally we have a full picture of how the service is being delivered, how it's going to impact us if the service isn't provided. Is it just affecting us or the wider business? Are we able to continue operating? Is that type of information that allows us to not only assess the vendor in the right way by sending them the right content or checking the right boxes from a content perspective, but also how we actually manage those risk items as well. So if any risks are identified from a vendor that's particularly high priority, maybe we have different timescales for managing those risks. So it just adds that layer of maturity to this process. And of course, the quicker we can manage these risks, obviously, the more confidence we can have in the supplier as well. Okay. And one other piece to mention here very quickly before we move on is the attributes. These might seem like they're not useful now, and they're not immediately providing value to the assessment process, but there's a lot we can do with this information from a querying or a reporting standpoint. So, for example, knowing that the organization interacts with personal information, that's got to be something we store, so that one day we can say, right, show me all of our third parties that interact with a particularly sensitive type of information. And it might be that we don't have that question today, but we've got to preempt some of these questions later on of what information we might need, so that we can query the right vendors when we need to.
Yeah, it's a fantastic point, Joe, and certainly thinking about being able to group and categorize vendors, particularly if there's a consistency in what's being supplied, and having that sort of visibility as early as possible can also help shape the focus of the organization in terms of the level of engagement, the type of assessment that we may need to impress upon these third parties.
Yep. Okay, accuracy. Is the content fit for purpose? This is very much in your realm here, Tom, but making sure that we are sending out the right questions or asking the right questions of our vendors is obviously really important from a compliance and regulatory standpoint. Making sure we have an assessment of control specific to the service that are being provided as well is something that's going to be hugely valuable. A lot of the times when we're working with vendors, we only really get a limited time to interact with them, and when we do grab their time, we need to make sure it's worthwhile and we get everything we need to, all the context we need to not only assess risk now, but for any other breaches or whatever might happen in the future. So making sure that we have content that we capture all of the information we need to is going to be something really valuable. And of course, we have to look at the other end of the spectrum as well. We don't want to ask questions that aren't relevant, because it might put off a vendor from answering our question sets at all. So we really have to fine tune that process to make question content as optimized as possible, to give us what we need to make a good decision and manage the risks appropriately as well. Tom, anything to add on that one?
Yes, and the building the frameworks, not only from as you've mentioned, Joe, from a compliance and regulatory perspective, and sometimes it's actually could be easier than others. If there's pressure to assess, I used the term obviously GDPR earlier from a privacy perspective. When it comes to regulation, you could argue in many ways it is a bit easier, because more often than not, regulations are quite black and white. You need to have a privacy policy in place. You need to have a process to manage, hold, store, and protect data, for example. But obviously outside of the regulatory piece, when building surveys, being mindful of the size and the complexity of the third parties who will be receiving them and receiving those type of assessments is really critical as well. Sending out an information security assessment, for example, to a global software company versus sending it out to a very small ad agency, for example, and you can get very different responses. Both questions are going to be relevant, but you need to make sure they're measured and delivered in a way that you know you're going to get the best result from that vendor.
Yeah. And one of your buzzwords there, Tom, at the bottom, continual improvement. I think it's really important to revisit these your content often. I mean, there's been a lot of cases in the past where we're asking questions of some of our clients and some of the organizations we work with, and we actually say, you know, can we change this questionnaire content to improve it, to enhance it? And some organizations don't want to touch it because it exists. They don't know why it exists or where it came from, but they just know they don't want to disturb it. And that just shows evidence that, you know, it potentially hasn't been looked at in a long time. And there's no real justification internally for why they're sending out the type of questions they are and what the objective of some of these questions is as well. So I think it's really important to manage that process or implement a process to ensure that that sort of thing is monitored and reviewed on an ongoing basis.
Absolutely, and just lastly to say, and that's where I think the focus area comes into it quite nicely as well. No, but getting to the stage where as an organization you say, we know we're sending out this survey, but based on the type of third parties we're engaging with, based on our business strategy, based on new and emerging risk, we need to focus in these areas, and these are the aspects that we need to really, as I say, impress upon the third party. And so it's important to say, if you can get to a stage where you know what focus areas you need to be aware of, particularly when risks come back.
Mm-hmm. Management of assessment responses. I think this is a really important one. A lot of times we're conducting risk assessments where we try to engage third parties or vendors, and they're not responding on time or not responding within a satisfactory time, let alone at all. And some of the things we can do here is set up a process that makes sure we manage or know how to react to those specific circumstances. It could be the vendor hasn't scheduled this type of activity in, and they're not going to get around to completing the assessment within X amount of time. It might be that you got the wrong contact information. It might be that we're not seeing any response or any engagement from them at all. So making sure we have a workflow to actually escalate this within the business or know how to react to it is going to be very, very important. I think a lot of the time, if we're not seeing engagement from a vendor, it's if we do escalate this to the supplier relationship manager or whoever is responsible for that relationship, you know, only good things can come from trying to engage with them and contacting them to keep them in the loop with, you know, what you're trying to achieve, when you need things by. And obviously, the more the heads up you can provide a vendor, the more chance they are at scheduling it in accordingly and being able to respond on time as well.
Absolutely, and I guess, Joe, would you say from a positive perspective as well as making sure, you know, are we following up with those vendors, particularly those that are for whatever reason not responding or are non-responsive, but providing as clear guidance as possible. So, you know, this is why it's being sent out, or this is help to say, you know, ultimately we want the best response from yourselves. So as much, I guess, setting that expectation at the earliest opportunity, but providing that helpline as well is key.
Yeah, I think we need as much communication as possible, you know, ahead of the exercise. We need to provide them with sufficient guidance on timelines and when we're expecting responses by. I think the content that we send out needs to be tailored and it needs to be focused so that we're not spending excessive time from the vendor's perspective by sending out an 800 question assessment, for example. And I think, you know, collectively putting those together is going to really improve response rates. And it shows there's been some consideration and some workings out behind some of these processes that are put in place as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
One other quick point to add there as well is, as well as always engaging the vendor, there should always be that communication channel back into the business if they have questions around the content, why we're doing this, and obviously if they've got any queries regarding the content as well. As I said, you only get normally one opportunity to engage with the vendor and grab their time for them to complete an assessment. So we need to make it worthwhile. We need to make sure that if they have any questions, there's somewhere they can go to, so that we don't get inaccurate data back from these types of exercises as well. On to risk management and response.
Yes. So yes, is there a standardized risk management process? So we've got to the stage where we've issued out an assessment to third parties. They've completed it in time permitted and through the communication process, as Joe's explained. We've now got to the stage where risks are being sent back, and this being sent back in obviously various forms. But hopefully, we've now got a collection of different risks for different vendors or third parties. Well, the immediate issue here is if those deficiencies, again, are not properly scored or reviewed, particularly when thinking about internal risk appetite. And this can be so important, this idea of, well, we've got some risks. Hopefully, we've got to a stage where we can categorize them. So impact over likelihood, for example, criticals, mediums, highs, and lows. But if we haven't identified what our risk appetite is as a business, are we going to be accepting or not accepting everything? Are there areas where we say we cannot accept this type of risk? And then secondly, moving on to the concept of the remediation process. Again, identifying a collection of risks, which again, hopefully we've reached a point where they are critical, high, medium, and low. If we don't know what to do with them, or potentially equally, if not more dangerously, are applying the wrong type of remediation, it's not going to give us the answer we want, and ultimately, a risk may increase or multiply in some cases. So having a clear playbook of saying, based on best practices, based on standards, based on regulations, in some cases, it's where you can lean on the regulation to say there's a very clear expectation of what this should look like moving forward. And if they haven't done it, we're using this to drive that remediation, making it clear to those third parties, this is what we expect you to be doing. Yeah. Context as well, obviously not factored into the review, and making sure we align that context of the third parties, thinking about the profiling and tiering. If we know, for example, that we have a series of third parties who are using personally identifiable information, and privacy is a big deal, we may need to make sure that any risk associated with data privacy, data security, for example, from the security survey, we apply additional remediation or additional emphasis to make sure that those risks are being managed appropriately. And then finally, obviously, the monitoring process as well, the ability to say you're not just sending some remediations back and sending it back to the third party, but there's also a process to, again, continually engage and communicate and set tasks to say, these are actions we need you to resolve, and we'll work with you to continually monitor and for you to communicate back to us, hopefully when those remediations are complete.
Hey guys, I'm jumping in as I know I said I wouldn't, but there's two questions that are pertaining to what you were just talking about that I think, since for the sake of time, let's just answer those really quickly, if that's okay.
Perfect.
Okay, so both are about non-responsiveness. So in regards to that, when coordinating a query to a third party, what are thoughts on best practices for handling third parties that are in essence non-responsive? It's an inevitable occurrence, and I imagine every organization views the risk differently based on their appetite/tolerance for the specific query or campaign.
Yeah, sure. I think if we're not getting responses back from a third party, I think we have to look for alternatives in some case. There may be other sources of information we can use to make a determination on the level of risk for a particular vendor. To take an example, some of the big players, the Amazons of the world and things, they might not be willing to complete an assessment, but they may have some other supporting evidence that you can use to drive some of your decision making for risks. Leveraging threat modules and other sources of information that can support some of your decisions are also going to be really useful. Otherwise, it's going to have to be a decision by the business of whether to accept that you're not getting the information you need.
Well, that pretty much answers the other question, which was, what examples of attestations are good for non-responsiveness, and also they're a commonly used source of third-party information for big companies are not responsive. So Microsoft was an example.
And as we mentioned on the remediation slide, I think where we touched on playbooks and things, there's often things we can introduce, some standardized mechanisms of how we view some of those common alternatives to an assessment being completed. So taking a SOC 2 report, for example, there's often mappings we can do back to our own content that can help. Same with ISO certifications as well. So this is all about preparing for some of this information ahead of time. If we have the mechanisms to interpret some of that information and find out what we need from it to give us confidence in a vendor, and we map that out ahead of time, then it's something we can prepare for. If we leave that till the last minute, then of course it's going to delay the process, and you don't have that repeatable process that you can launch for when this happens again.
Perfect. Thank you, Joe.
Perfect. Couple more slides to get through before the end. Firstly, touching on reporting. Very commonly, we see reporting being provided to the business that don't really have a full justification for why they exist. Common reports might be, how many open risks do we have within our business that need remediation? But what we really should be doing is going out to the various stakeholders that require information from the program or get some value out of the program, and actually identifying what questions they need to ask of us as the function that's providing this information. And reporting should always be built to match and answer some of those questions. Provided we're doing that, we're keeping the reporting nice and focused for the stakeholders. Once they see data and get a taste of the information and the value, it's only going to drive some motivation within the program and some traction. And then we can start getting a little bit more advanced in that reporting. Maybe we can introduce SLA levels or acceptable levels for the numbers of risks that we're seeing within the business as well. Or we get some established timeframes on how long we think things should be open within the business before they're resolved. So I think we should always be engaging with the business to make sure we're providing the right information, that it's nice and concise, and giving them what they need to from the program. And then lastly, on the governance piece, Tom, I don't know if you want to cover this one off for us.
Yes, absolutely. So overarching processes that are in place to ensure program operates effectively. So yes, this in many ways this is overarching. This sort of covers sits on top of everything that we've sort of just mentioned. But having clearly defined some manuals or procedures in place that outline that step process, and obviously making sure that this should set the framework for a standardized process, and it's a standardized piece I think that is key here. It's something that should be repeatable, no matter how many types of vendors you're engaging with the third parties. And roles and responsibilities are always critical. Who's taking ownership across each part of the process? When thinking about the wider sort of stakeholder engagement, I guess sometimes it can be easy to think of these areas as this is just something for supplier management team, for example, or this is just something for legal or other teams. But more often than not, there's a wider some business responsibility here. Training and awareness, which is really, really key, particularly for that accountability and understanding of how the third-party process operates. So being able to have internal marketing campaigns, I say training and awareness sessions to say, this is how we operate when engaging with the third parties, but equally importantly, when risks are coming back or when issues are being identified, there is a need to reach out to the wider teams and having that visibility and education on the TPRM and impact it causes. And then, of course, yes, critical success factors. So having clear objectives and success criteria with which you can regularly monitor the program to say, well, we set out to achieve this when engaging and managing our third parties. Are we meeting those? So these can be something that is very granular. It can be something that is perhaps more strategic in terms of the type of vendors that the organization is engaging with.
Good stuff. I think one thing to mention there on the objectives front, just as a final closing comment, is just to make sure that these objectives are reviewed. I think commonly you set out on a goal to solve third-party risk. Sometimes we need to break it down into more bite-sized chunks of what we're trying to deliver by when, which obviously sets a more realistic goal and encourages more successes within the program that you can go and feed back to the business.
Absolutely.
We are pretty much on top of the hour here, but I just want to make sure we've covered everything, and maybe there's a couple of seconds left for questions. But Amanda, other than that, I'll pass it back to you.
Yeah, thank you. We're getting such great feedback, by the way, of how insightful this conversation is, and a lot of people are saying thank you for this. So thank you. I mean, you guys are just brilliant with this topic, but we are also curious here at Prevalent, are you looking to establish a third-party risk management program? Was this helpful for you in order to do that? Are you guys looking to look for an outside source to make that happen? So we'd love to get that question answered. Please be honest. Like I said, this is where I come in, and I'm going to follow up with you. And if I'm going to say, hey, I saw you said yes to this poll question, don't be surprised if I do that. And that's why I'm saying be honest. So definitely looking forward to connecting with the ones that say yes. But that's about it for me. If anyone has any other questions, utilize that info at prevalent.net. And I think that's it. Everyone's just saying great presentation. Awesome job. Time well spent. Fantastic presentation. 5 stars. This is great.
Wow.
Thank you everyone for all the kind words. We hope to see you at the next one. I'll let everyone go. And it's science. That's what someone just said. It is science. It's all science. Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.